Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech, and this is deck number 167 and it's titled Muscle Wizard. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Reanimated Salvage over on Reddit, and that card is Rootcoil Creeper. So Rootcoil Creeper is a green and a blue for a 2/2 plant horror. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, or you can tap it to add 2 mana of any one color, but spend this mana only to cast spells from your graveyard. Then you can pay a green and a blue and tap it and exile the Rootcoil Creeper to return a card with flashback that you own from exile to your hand. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, when I first started building this deck, I had no idea what direction I wanted to take it. My assumption was some sort of flashback deck, but nothing really stuck out to me as being a Simic flashback deck that I really thought could take good advantage of Rootcoil Creeper. So instead, I kind of dug around through commanders and eventually found one that I did really like, and that is what we're going with, but we are only in the Simic colors, and notably, we are playing a commander that also has a background. So this week, we are playing Gale Waterdeep Prodigy and Raised by Giants. So Gale is 2 and a blue for a 1/3 legendary creature human wizard. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell from your hand, you may cast up to 1 target card of the other type from your graveyard. If a spell cast from your graveyard this way would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. Then, of course, choose a background. So, our second commander as a background is Raised by Giants, which is 5 and a green for a legendary enchantment background. Commander creatures you own have base power and toughness 10/10 and are giants in addition to their other types. So you can kind of see what we want to be doing with Gale, which is of course casting spells from our graveyard. Notably, Gale does not let us cast them for free, so we do still have to spend mana for them, which is where Rootcoil Creeper is going to come in. But you might be wondering, why Raised by Giants? Yes, we needed a green background to be able to play Gale and the Rootcoil Creeper, but we could have picked any of them. So to explain a little bit more, let's jump into some of our themes for the deck. We'll talk about what we're doing and why specifically we chose Raised by Giants. So first off, of course, we want to be playing instants and sorceries. And the way that I broke this down was trying to focus on very cheap instants, so that way we can cast some very expensive sorceries. And the way that we're going to be doing that is through combat tricks. Being able to cast an instant speed Hunger of the Howl pack for a single green mana to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, or, if morbid, if a creature died this turn, put 3 +1/+1 counters on that creature instead. So that is why we're playing Raised by Giants, because Gale is actually our win condition. This is a kind of a Voltron strategy where the more spells we cast, the bigger Gale is going to get, and the more likely he is to just start taking people out of the game, hence, of course, the name Muscle Wizard for the deck title. Now, if we're playing all these small instants to be able to trigger Gale and cast sorceries out of our graveyard, which, very importantly, does ignore timing restrictions. So if we cast a 1 mana instant on our opponent's turn, we could cast a sorcery from our graveyard on an opponent's turn because Gale's ability gets around the timing restrictions. So with that in mind, we're casting the small instants to be able to get the large sorceries. So we want things like Clone Legion, which is 7 blue for a sorcery. For each creature target player controls, create a token that's a copy of that creature. It is very expensive. It's a massive 9 mana, but essentially for 10 mana, we could cast Clone Legion and Hunger of the Howl pack. Whichever one we cast out of our hand doesn't matter because we still get the other out of the graveyard. So we're able to kind of just play around with the stuff in our graveyard and make sure that it's always available to us, even if it's a sorcery, and hopefully get to the point where we have Gale large enough that any of our small combat tricks are enough to push through damage. And if it doesn't, then whatever large sorcery we cast in addition to that also puts threats on the table. So that is the main focus of what this deck is really trying to do. And then our third theme ties that all together because we have cards that care about casting spells from the graveyard. A great example of that is Secrets of the Dead, which is 2 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, draw a card. So we are generating a ton of card advantage in this deck because every spell we cast that goes to the graveyard, we can cast again in the future. And if we're using Secrets of the Dead, we're also able to keep drawing cards as well, meaning we can kind of just slowly outvalue our opponents and then take them down with a huge Gale. So with all of that being said, those are our themes for this week. And the next thing I want to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that are sometimes win conditions or huge value engines, but for the most part, they're the cards we really want to see as the game progresses. So our first key card that I want to talk about is going to be Shark Typhoon. And Shark Typhoon is 5 and a blue for an enchantment. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create an XX blue shark creature token with flying, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. Then it has cycling for X, 1 and a blue, and when you cycle it, you create an XX blue shark creature token with flying. Now, we can cycle this early in the game if we are trying to hit some land drops or we're just trying to find specific cards. But what we really want to do is cast it for 6 mana, because then every single spell we cast, and most of our spells are non-creature spells, we're going to be making sharks. And they're not just 1/1 tokens, they are flying sharks with power equal to the spell's mana cost. So if we cast some of our huge sorceries like Clone Legion for 9 mana, we make a 9/9 flying creature, and if we can flood the board with those kinds of creatures plus some of our combat tricks, our opponents are going to have a really tough time deciding what to block and how to block, because there's no guarantee that we won't just be able to give something trample or push through a little extra damage. So Shark Typhoon is a great way to ensure that even though we don't play a ton of creatures, we still have creatures in play for when things need to happen. Now, that's of course not our only key card. Our next key card is a little bit different but plays in the same space, and that is Exponential Growth. So Exponential Growth is XX green for a sorcery that says until the end of turn, double target creature's power X times. And the reason that this is going to be so good for us is because, one, we're in Simic, we're able to ramp pretty effectively, and we can rebuy a lot of our ramp spells. But since we want to be taking people out with Gale, this is one of those sorceries that when we can cast it at instant speed, can just close out games. Being able to cast a really cheap instant spell and then play Exponential Growth for maybe 6 mana, so X equals 2, means that we're turning Gale into, maybe say he's got 5 power at that time because of whatever instant we cast, we double it to 10, double it to 20, and if we've put in any work up to that point, he's essentially a one-shot on any opponent at the table. So Exponential Growth is a really sneaky way to get in some extra combat damage and some extra commander damage, but it's also a great way to just close out games because that's really what we want to be doing. It fits perfectly with all of our synergies and all of our game plans. Now, moving into our last key card, this is also a huge sorcery, but this one focuses on card advantage because this is Rishkar's Expertise, which is 4 green for a sorcery. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control, and you may cast a spell with mana value 5 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So ideally, if we get a ton of mana and we get Gale to be huge throughout the course of the game, we're able to draw cards equal to his power and then cast a spell for free. And notably, we are casting a spell from our hand, which does trigger Gale's ability to cast something from our graveyard as well. So we can cast something with Rishkar's Expertise, but we can also cast something else with the spell we cast from our hand, provided it is an instant or sorcery. So not only is this going to be drawing us a ton of cards as the game progresses, but it's going to be one of the best burst card advantage engines because it's also allowing us to cast multiple spells at the same time. So Rishkar's Expertise really does everything you want it to do in this deck and is one of the best card draw engines in the entire deck. Now, with all of that being said, though, we're going to move on from our key cards and we're going to get into some of our cool interactions. And these are cards that really synergize well together, or in some cases are just cards that I really want to highlight because I think they're, well, kind of cool. So the first pair of cards I want to talk about is going to be Ominous Roost and Increasing Savagery. So Ominous Roost is 2 and a blue for an enchantment when Ominous Roost enters the battlefield, or whenever you cast a spell from your graveyard, create a 1/1 blue bird creature token with flying, and this creature can block only creatures with flying. So this is going to be great just as a general value engine throughout the course of the game. Being able to make a blue bird every single time we're casting a spell from our graveyard means that we are constantly amassing an army of flyers, and yeah, they're not particularly great on defense, but hopefully we're going to use them more for offense than we are for defense. And that's even more relevant when we combine it with Increasing Savagery, which is 2 green for a sorcery, put 5 +1/+1 counters on target creature. If Increasing Savagery was cast from a graveyard, put 10 +1/+1 counters on that creature instead, and it has flashback for 5 green. So this is one of the few actual spells with flashback that we put into the deck. Because of the way that it's worded, it actually functions perfectly fine with Gale in a way that most spells aren't going to. The wording that says if it was cast from a graveyard, put 10 counters on it, doesn't mean you have to cast it for its flashback cost. We can still use Gale's ability to cast it for just 4 mana to get 10 +1/+1 counters instead. Then, worst case scenario, we also have Rootcoil Creeper to get it back from exile so we can do it again, essentially giving us a total, at least possibly total, of 30 +1/+1 counters by casting this from our hand twice and then from the graveyard twice. But the reason I wanted to highlight it alongside Ominous Roost is because Ominous Roost is making flying creatures. Being able to take a 1/1 creature and just put 5 +1/+1 counters on it, make it a 6/6, and if you notice, these curve very well into each other, going from 3 mana for Ominous Roost to 4 for Increasing Savagery, we can immediately just cast the Ominous Roost, make a bird when it enters, cast the Increasing Savagery next turn, make it a 6/6, and just start swinging it at people. And then once it's in our graveyard, we can do it again, put 10 +1/+1 counters on a creature, again, hopefully a flyer, and then keep doing damage and just kind of pressure the rest of the table in a way that they might not be expecting from the Simic deck. But that is not the only cool interaction that I wanted to talk about, and the other one, while very similar, is more of just kind of a one-shot, take someone out of the game kind of interaction, and that is between Shadow Rift and Body of Research. So Shadow Rift, 1 blue for an instant, target creature gains Shadow until the end of turn, which means it can only block or be blocked by other creatures with Shadow, and of course it draws a card. And if we combine that with Body of Research, which is green, blue for a sorcery, create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token, and put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of cards in your library. So if we do a little bit of quick math, and please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but at the start of your game, say you draw 7 cards, you've got your commander in the command zone, there are 8 cards out of your deck. You eventually draw until you get to 6 lands, just naturally. So you've drawn at least 6 cards because you've had 6 turns. So at that point, you have, 14 cards out of your deck. So if you cast Body of Research just then, having made no other changes, you should get an 86 power fractal. And that, combined with Shadow Rift, which will essentially make that fractal unblockable, is more than enough to take anybody out. And yes, this isn't super quick, your opponents can see it coming, but again, keep in mind that with Gale's ability, we can cast our sorceries at instant speed if we're doing it out of our graveyard. So we can always cast Body of Research, and if someone deals with the fractal, that's okay, because now at the end of someone's turn, we can cast it at instant speed, untap, then Shadow Rift, and just take out whoever's the biggest threat at the table. So like I said, kind of a one-shot take somebody out of the game, which I know is not always fun for everybody, but it is a way to deal with a prominent threat in a way that the rest of our deck might take a few turns to do so. So I did want to highlight that. Plus, Body of Research is just a really cool card, and I'm always looking for excuses to throw it into a deck. So hopefully that makes some sense to you, but we're going to be moving on now to the budget portion of the actual deck, because I know that is one of the more important pieces of an actual budget build. So this week, our deck actually came in at less than half of its normal price at $48.12, with the most expensive card in the entire deck being Dika Fractal Theorist at only $3.93. So normally, we have a much more expensive card in our most expensive cards slot. However, I do want to highlight that Dika is a very important card for this deck and a very powerful synergy piece, because she is 4 and a blue for a 3/3 human wizard. She has Magecraft, so whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we make a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token and put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is that spell's mana value. And, the most important part, 3 and a blue, target creature token can't be blocked this turn. So again, that could be our giant body of research fractal token. That could be the fractal tokens that Dika creates. It could be the shark tokens from Shark Typhoon. Dika is, other than Gale, one of the most efficient ways for us to end the game, because we are going to be casting a lot of huge spells, and being able to make those tokens unblockable that have power equal to the mana value of the spells that we cost means that this is going to be an incredibly quick way to end the game in the late game. It of course takes a while to get going, which is also why she's around $4. So she's not necessarily the most important card in the deck. I do think that she deserves a spot in the deck, and if you do need to trim her down for any budget purposes, you can. There are of course other cards that you could throw in that do something similar. They just won't typically come with the unblockable clause, which makes Dika so good. On the other hand though, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit out of the price range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well, and of course the card that I would replace it with. So the card that I would recommend putting in, if you don't mind increasing the budget just a little bit, would be Berserk, and the card I would recommend taking out would be Patrician Geist. So Berserk is 1 green mana for an instant, so it fits that mono green cheap instant that we want to have. Cast Berserk only before the combat damage step. Target creature gains trample and gets +X+0 until the end of turn, where X is its power. Then at the beginning of the next end step, destroy that creature if it attacked this turn. So with Gale and Raised by Giants, we can guarantee that Gale would have a minimum power of 10, meaning that he immediately becomes a 20 power creature with Berserk and gets trample, which is enough to take out most players if we've put in some work already. And if we've got even just one additional +1/+1 counter on Gale, he is a one-shot with commander damage no matter what. So Berserk is incredibly powerful in this deck. And yeah, we would have to sacrifice Gale, but it's not the end of the world because he is pretty cheap. We can just recast him, and I would say that trading our commander to knock an opponent out of the game is probably a pretty decent trade. Now, if we are putting a card in, like I said, we would have to take a card out, and the card that I would recommend taking out would be Patrician Geist, which is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 Spirit Knight. It has flying. Other spirits you control get +1/+1, and spells you cast from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. Now, originally when I put this in, I was thinking that this would essentially act as a ramp spell, making all of our graveyard spells cost 1 less. But as I play tested this deck, I realized that that didn't come into play as often as I wanted it to, and the 1 mana reduction didn't quite do enough as the game went on, especially into the late game, because we were really only casting 1 big spell every single turn, and just cutting it down by 1 wasn't really enough to stop that pattern. So I do think Patrician Geist is good. It might be better in a deck that wants to cast multiple spells from the graveyard every single turn, because then you can get more value out of it, but I don't think this is the deck for it, just because, like I said, we want to cast 1 big spell every time around the table, and Patrician Geist doesn't really help us with that too much. So if you don't mind the budget upgrade, then I would recommend swapping out Berserk for Patrician Geist, but if you are worried about the budget, you can of course just keep the Geist in. It does still do a fine job, and is still a relevant member of the deck. So with all of that being said, we of course have to move on from our deck tech and get into the actual gameplay of the deck, see how it performs against some opponents. But before we get to that, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. And of course, shout out our current patrons and channel members. So as always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out more than you know. And if you think that you're subscribed because you keep seeing our videos pop up for you, just double check it for me. We get a lot of views from people who are not subscribed, which is awesome. We appreciate you all very much, but I would also appreciate it if you'd subscribe as well. So if you're looking to support us that way, you can. You can also find us on some other accounts as well, some social media accounts. You can find us on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member. And of course, a huge shout out to all of our current patrons and channel members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Patty Whack, Richard, Devin Purser, and Brian Haney. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And without rambling on too long about the channel, let's move on to the actual game and see how our Muscle Wizard does in practice. So this week, this game was actually already recorded because it happened over on that TCG guy, or Corey, on his Twitch channel, which I will make sure to put in the description of the video. Do go check Corey out. He's an awesome guy, puts on some amazing content. But this happened on his stream a little while ago, and we are going to be playing, of course, against Corey with his Breaches the Blastmaker deck, but also against KJ playing the Peregrine Dynamo, and Obzedadi, living up to his Orzhov name, playing Kambal Profiteering Mayor. So starting off with KJ and his Peregrine Dynamo deck, personally, I am very excited to see how this deck performs. Obviously, I'm talking in the future tense as though this game hasn't already happened, I suppose, force of habit. But the Peregrine Dynamo, I was, at the time, very excited to see how this deck performed because it is a very unique idea for a commander. It's essentially colorless legendaries, and it doesn't necessarily have to be legendary creatures because Peregrine Dynamo can copy abilities from planeswalkers, from artifacts, from enchantments, from lands. As long as it's legendary, he's able to copy it with the Peregrine Dynamo. So it's a very cool concept for a deck, and we don't see a ton of colorless commanders on the channel, so I am very excited to show this deck off, as I'm sure KJ was as well. Next up, we have Obzedadi playing Kambal Profiteering Mayor, and this deck, I will not give any spoilers, obviously, to the game that's about to happen, but I will say Kambal really surprised me with the ability to generate tokens. I was thinking that it wasn't going to be a super efficient ability, it was going to be mostly an aristocrat build, but Obzedadi leaned pretty heavily into the actual token generation ability of Kambal, and it made for a very unique deck that was a ton of fun to play against, so do go check that deck out as well. I think it's super sweet, and it's definitely got a lot of unique interactions in it. And then last but not least, of course, we have Corey, the host of this game, playing Breaches. This is not necessarily a Storm deck, because Breaches really just wants you to cast 2 spells a turn, but it's Storm in a way that he wants to cast at least 2 spells a turn, and then try to find ways to win a coin flip with Breaches, to copy a spell and sacrifice artifacts. So it's a very unique mix of Spellslinger and artifacts, which I think is super cool. And Breaches just seems like a very fun commander in general. So let me know at the end of the game, of course, what you all think of all the decks. Let me know what you thought of our deck and our opponents of the game. And if you haven't already seen this video over on Corey's channel, let me know down in the comments what your prediction is for the game. Who do you think is going to be walking out the winner? Who's going to have the play of the game? All of that kind of stuff. So hopefully you all enjoy it. I certainly did. This game was a ton of fun, and I'm very excited to get to show it off to you all. So, like I said, hope you enjoy it, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, KJ goes first, followed by Obzedadi, myself, and then Corey. On KJ's first turn, he plays a Wastes. Obzedadi plays an Arid Mesa, paying a life and sacrificing it to search his library for a shadowy backstreet, putting it into play and surveilling 1. I play a Command Tower. Corey plays a Frostboil Snarl, revealing an island so it comes into play untapped. KJ plays a Darksteel Citadel, then casts Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size. Obzedadi plays a Plains, and then casts Skull Clamp. I play an island. Corey plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. KJ plays a Temple of the False God, then casts his commander, the Peregrine Dynamo, letting him pay 1 and tap it to copy an activated or triggered ability he controls from a non-commander legendary. Since it also has haste, KJ attacks Obzedadi for 1. Obzedadi plays a Fetid Heath and casts his commander, Kambal Profiteering Mayor, letting him make a tapped copy of each token that enters under his opponent's control, but only once each turn, and also letting him gain a life while each of his opponents loses a life whenever 1 or more tokens enters under his control. I play a forest and cast my commander, Gale Waterdeep Prodigy, letting me cast an instant or sorcery from my graveyard whenever I cast a spell of the other type. Corey plays an island and casts his commander, Breaches the Blastmaker, letting him sacrifice an artifact when he casts his second spell each turn, then flipping a coin, copying the spell if he wins, and doing damage equal to the spell's mana value to any target if he loses. KJ plays a Blast Zone and casts Worn Power Stone. Obzedadi plays a Swamp and casts Benny Brack's Zoologist, letting him draw a card in each end step if he created a token that turn. He then equips Benny with Skull Clamp, giving him +1/-1, and letting him draw 2 cards when he dies. On my turn, I play an island. Corey plays an island and plots a Pyretic Charge. KJ plays a Wastes and casts Ugin the Ineffable, making his colorless spells cost 1 less to cast. Then he activates Ugin's +1 ability to exile the top card of his library and make a 2/2 Spirit, putting the exiled card into his hand when the spirit dies. Then he activates the Peregrine Dynamo, copying the ability, exiling another card and making another spirit. After that, he casts Junk Diver, which returns an artifact from his graveyard to his hand when it dies. Obzedadi plays a Plains and casts Throne of Eldraine, naming black when it enters, so it taps for 4 black mana and can be activated to draw 2 cards. After that, he casts Massacre Girl, Known Killer, giving all his creatures Wither, and letting him draw a card when a creature dies if it had toughness equal to or less than 0. At the end of turn, I cast Shadow Rift, giving Gale Shadow until the end of turn and drawing a card. On my turn, I play a forest and cast Invasion of Arcavios, choosing Corey to defend it and searching my library for an instant or sorcery, in this case Body of Research, putting it into my hand. Corey plays a command tower and casts Gitaxian Probe by paying 2 life instead of mana, looking at KJ's hand and drawing a card. At this point, we also realize that KJ's Spirit token triggered Obzedadi's Kambal, so he also makes a Spirit token, draws a card, and gains a life while each of his opponents lose a life. KJ activates Ugin's +1 ability, again copying it with the Peregrine Dynamo, exiling the top 2 cards of his library and making 2 Spirit tokens. This also allows Obzedadi to make a Spirit, gain a life, and make each opponent lose a life. After that, KJ cast Horizon Stone, no longer losing mana as steps and phases end, but turning that mana into colorless mana. Then, at the end of turn, Obzedadi draws a card with Benny Brax. On his turn, he plays a Scrubland and casts Wedding Ring, marrying Corey, so he creates a token copy of it. This triggers Kambal, letting Obzedadi make another copy of Wedding Ring, gain a life, and make each of his opponents lose a life. Then, whenever a player who controls Wedding Ring gains life or draws a card during their turn, the other player who controls a Wedding Ring does the same, meaning Corey also gains a life. After that, Obzedadi casts Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose, making target opponent lose life equal to any life he gains, then equips Skull Clamp to a Spirit token and uses it to attack Ugin for 3. Finally, at the end of turn, he draws a card from Benny Brax, which also lets Corey draw a card. On my turn, I play an island and cast Body of Research, making a 0/0 fractal token and putting a number of +1/+1 counters on it, equal to the number of cards in my library, which is currently 83. This also triggers Kambal, so Obzedadi makes a fractal, which has no counters, so it immediately dies, but he does gain a life, make each opponent lose a life, and makes Corey lose an extra life, then draws a card at the end of turn for Benny Brax. Also at the end of turn, Corey casts Bottle Cap Blast, doing 5 damage to Junk Diver, killing it and making 4 tap treasures since the spell dealt 4 excess damage. On Corey's turn, he plays an island, casts a soul ring, and casts a braid, triggering breaches so he sacrifices a treasure, flips a coin, losing the flip and doing 2 damage to Obzedadi. Then the abrade resolves, destroying Skull Clamp. At the end of turn, KJ floats 5 colorless mana, keeping it with Horizon Stone. On KJ's turn, he casts Ever-Flowing Chalice, kicked twice so it enters with 2 charge counters and can tap for 2 colorless mana. After that, he casts Kozilek the Great Distortion, drawing 5 cards so he has 7 cards in hand. Then he's able to discard a card to counter a spell with the same mana value as the discarded card. He plays a Miko Koro, Center of the Sea, and casts Aetherworks Marvel, getting an energy whenever a permanent he controls dies, and letting him pay 6 energy to look at the top 6 cards of his library and cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost. After that, he attacks each opponent for 2 with one of his spirit tokens, and we all block with 2 of the spirits dying, so both cards connected to them return to KJ's hand and he gets 2 energy while none of us take any damage. In his second main phase, he casts the One Ring, getting protection from everything until his next turn, and letting him tap it to put a burden counter on it and draw cards equal to the burden counters on it, then taking damage equal to the burden counters in his upkeep. Finally, he activates Ugin's +1 ability, exiling the top card of his library to create a spirit token, which allows Obzedadi to also make a spirit, gain a life, make each opponent lose a life, and make me lose an additional life. On Obzedadi's turn, he plays a Command Tower, then casts Delny Streetwise Lookout, doubling the triggered abilities of creatures he controls with power 2 or less. He also casts Commissar Severina Rain, making each opponent lose X life when she attacks, where X is the number of other attacking creatures. After that, Obzedadi casts Bloodletter of Aclazotz, doubling the life his opponents would lose while it's his turn. On my turn, I cast Primeval Bounty, letting me make a 3/3 beast token when I cast a creature, put 3 +1/+1 counters on a creature when I cast a non-creature, and gain 3 life when I play a land. I then play a Desert of the Mindful, gaining 3 life, and attack Invasion of Arcavios with my Fractal, transforming it into Invocation of the Founders, letting me copy any instant or sorcery I cast from my hand. Since this is also cast as a non-creature, I put 3 +1/+1 counters on Gale. On Corey's turn, he plays an island and casts Wand of Wonder, immediately activating it to roll a d20 and make each opponent exile cards from the top of their libraries until they exile an instant or sorcery. Then if Corey rolls a 1 through 9, he casts one of the spells. If he rolls a 10 to 19, he casts 2 of them, and if he rolls a 20, he casts all 3. In response, KJ activates the One Ring, using his commander to copy the ability, so he draws 3 cards and puts 2 burden counters on it. Then the wand resolves with Corey rolling a 10, being able to cast 2 spells, while KJ exiles all his dust, Obzedadi exiles Get Lost, and I exile Inscription of Abundance. Corey chooses to cast the Get Lost first, triggering breaches, so he sacrifices an artifact, flips a coin, wins the flip, copies the spell, and destroys Ugin and Kozilek, letting KJ make 4 total map tokens, which also lets Obzedadi make 2 map tokens, gain 2 life, make each opponent lose 2 life, and make me lose an additional 4. Then he casts my Inscription of Abundance, gaining himself 3 life, since he controls a creature with 3 power. Then at the end of turn, Obzedadi draws a card with Benny Brax. In KJ's upkeep, he loses 2 life to the One Ring, plays an Inventor's Fair, activates the One Ring, copying it with his commander to put 2 burden counters on it and draw 7 total cards. After that, he casts Forsaken Monument, giving his colorless creatures +2/+2, letting his permanents that produce colorless mana tap for an additional colorless mana, and gaining 2 life whenever he casts a colorless spell. Then he casts Basalt Monolith, which now taps for 5 and can untap itself for 3, allowing him to generate infinite colorless mana. With that mana, he's able to sacrifice Inventor's Fair to search his library for an artifact, in this case Mirror Battlesphere, putting it into his hand and casting it, making 4 1/1 mirror tokens when it enters the battlefield, which means Obzedadi also makes 8 mirrors, gains 2 life, makes each opponent lose 2 life, and makes KJ lose an additional 4. Finally, KJ casts Artisan Golem, which allows him to pay 2 mana to give an artifact creature +1/+1, flying, trample, or haste until the end of turn. With his infinite mana, he's able to make all of his creatures infinitely large, give them all haste and trample, allowing him to knock out each of his opponents with 1 huge attack, winning KJ the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely didn't get to do quite as much as I was hoping to with the deck, but there were a couple of key moments that I want to talk about in regards to how our deck performed and what we did. Now, notably, I kept a very slow hand. I was not expecting the rest of the table to pop off quite as quickly as they did. Corey kind of mentioned the same thing. He and I were both not doing too much for a good portion of that game. But I think what was interesting was that on the turn when KJ dropped the one ring, we actually had the ability to take him out of the game with our fractal token. Because we had the shadow ability in our graveyard, we could have cast another sorcery, flashed back the instant, given our token shadow, and gotten in for an unblockable 83 amount of damage to take a player out of the game. And I still could have done that on my turn, maybe taken out Obzedadi or Corey, but it didn't feel like something that I should be doing, considering it definitely felt like KJ was the threat at that point, and considering he then untapped and won the game, I would argue that that kind of makes sense. So, not to say that our deck didn't do anything, it definitely did more than it looked like, and we had things in our hand that were going to start putting a ton of +1/+1 counters on things, but we just couldn't find a time to attack because we really just got off to a slow start. So while the deck didn't perform as well as I hoped, it still did kind of what the deck wanted to do. It was just a little bit slower at doing it. So let me know in the comments what you thought of the deck, and of course what you think of the deck list in general, and what we can either add to it or cards that maybe shouldn't be in there, because I always love hearing people's opinions on how you would build this deck. Of course, I do also want to talk about everyone else's decks at the table. Like I mentioned, Corey really didn't get the chance to do too much. He kind of struggled a little bit in the early game as well, and so once he started to get enough mana to really do things and generate treasures, the game started to wrap up. So a little bit unfortunate on his end. Otherwise, though, Obzedadi's deck, the Kambal deck, very, very impressive. I thought it did a tremendous job at just creating a ton of tokens, and I thought it was super cool that he leaned into ways to give his opponents tokens, like the wedding ring, because then he could take advantage of that kind of stuff, which I honestly, like I said, didn't even think about when we sat down to play this deck. I just figured it was going to be a traditional aristocrats deck. We'd have to worry about blood artists, but it was super cool to see all of the token generation and the amount of tokens that were generated by his opponents that he had nothing to do with and just got to make free tokens. It really seemed like Kambal was a huge value engine, and it's a very cool deck that I might look into putting together myself. So we'll see how that one goes. But last but not least, of course, our winner of the game, KJ, did a phenomenal job. I was very, very impressed by the absolute speed of the colorless deck. I wasn't expecting to just get completely outdrawn and outdealt with and outdamaged by the colorless deck. It really just goes to show how powerful the One Ring is, because it drew, I believe over the course of the game, I think it drew 10 cards, even though it was only on the field for 2 turns. So being able to combine that with the Peregrine Dynamo was super, super powerful and very impressive. And of course, the Golem Artisan, I didn't know if I'd ever seen that card before, but it was a really just a key card in doing what his deck wanted to do and knocking people out. So it was super cool to see a lot of cards that don't see a lot of love normally, because there's typically other cards that could throw in there that have a color, but of course the color limitations of that deck definitely made it very cool to see. So I hope you all enjoyed the game. Like I said, I certainly did. Go and check out everybody's accounts. I'll make sure to link everybody down in the description. So if you want to find KJ, if you want to find Obzedadi or Corey on social media or on Twitch or anything like that, please do go check them out. They're amazing people. They were a ton of fun to play with. Hopefully I'll be able to get some games in with them in the future. But other than that, I hope you all enjoyed the deck tech. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay. If you did, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. And with all that being said, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.